They thought she wouldn't survive the night. An 8-year-old girl, scared, weak, and a shadow closing in with poison in his hand. But he didn't know. She had a guardian who had faced war, taken bullets, and never backed down. Not a soldier, at least, not the kind on 2 legs. Her protector was Ranger, a retired K-9 who once saved his handler's life overseas and was bought for just $1 by a former U.S. Army sergeant who knew the value of loyalty. When danger came for her, Ranger didn't just bark, he fought, shielded, and refused to let her go. What happened next will break your heart wide open, then stitch it back together with hope and gratitude. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe in second chances, if you believe no child should ever face fear alone, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will stay with you forever. Snowflakes drifted thick and slow over Willow Creek, Montana, coating the small town in a quiet white shroud. The 2-lane streets were lined with clapboard houses and dark pine trees bent under the weight of snow. The air bit at the skin, sharp and clean, and even the crunch of tires on ice seemed muted. A dark green pickup rolled into town from the highway, its exhaust puffing white into the frigid afternoon. Behind the wheel sat Daniel Reed, 38, a man whose broad frame and straight-backed posture spoke of years in the Army. His gray-blue eyes scanned habitually, even here, where the only threat was a patch of black ice. His face was weathered, his jawline strong, and there was a quiet heaviness in the way he gripped the steering wheel, the kind of steadiness forged by survival, not comfort. Years earlier, during a night patrol in a dusty war zone, Ranger had frozen mid-step, blocking Daniel from moving forward. Seconds later, an IED exploded just ahead, a blast that would have taken lives. That single act had saved Daniel's entire squad. When the K-9 unit retired him, the adoption fee was ceremonial, $1. Daniel had handed over the bill without hesitation, saying, "I'm not buying a dog, I'm bringing home my partner." He kept the name Ranger, the dog's call sign, because it had been earned under fire. The truck turned onto a narrow, snow-packed street, lined with bare trees and houses with soft yellow light glowing in the windows. Daniel's home, a modest 2-story with weathered blue paint, was dark. No lights, no sound. He frowned, cutting the engine. The silence pressed in, heavier than the snow. Ranger's ears swiveled forward. Daniel grabbed his duffel and the bouquet wrapped in paper. White lilies for Lily, his 8-year-old daughter, and red tulips for Marissa, his wife, and Lily's stepmother. He unlocked the front door, pushing it open to a blast of cold air. The house smelled faintly of dish soap, but felt hollow. Before Daniel could call out, Ranger slipped past him, nails clicking against the hardwood. The dog's body tensed, nose working the air, tail straight. Then, from deeper in the house, a sudden sharp bark erupted. One, then another, then a rapid series of barks edged with urgency. Daniel dropped the bouquet and followed. Ranger was in the kitchen, standing rigid beside the counter, barking toward the floor. As Daniel rounded the corner, his stomach clenched. Lily lay crumpled on the tile, her head resting awkwardly against the cabinet. Her face was pale, lips tinged blue, and her small hands twitched faintly. Her cotton dress clung awkwardly over a belly that looked unnaturally swollen. Ranger lowered his head to nudge her cheek, whining between sharp barks, as if trying to wake her. When she didn't stir, he turned his head toward Daniel, eyes wide, and barked again, a sound that demanded action. Daniel's training kicked in. He dropped to one knee, checking Lily's breath, shallow, uneven. Her skin was cold to the touch. "It's okay, baby. I've got you," he said, scooping her into his arms. Ranger circled once, then trotted ahead as though clearing the path to the door. Snow swirled harder as Daniel carried Lily to the truck. He laid her gently on the back seat. Ranger jumped in beside her without waiting for a command. The big shepherd pressed his warm body against hers, curling slightly to keep her from sliding, nose near her face. Daniel drove hard toward Willow Creek Medical Center, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror where he could see Ranger's head bent over Lily like a sentry. Halfway there, his gaze caught on the old K-9 ID tag hanging from the visor, its metal dulled and edges worn. The words, "Protect First," were still legible, etched years ago as the unit's motto. In that moment, it felt less like an old slogan and more like a promise being fulfilled. At the emergency entrance, Daniel jumped out, gathering Lily into his arms. Ranger leapt down after him, barking loudly, his voice echoing in the cold air until a nurse pushed open the sliding door. Warm light and the smell of antiseptic washed over them as Daniel rushed inside. Ranger stayed close enough that his flank brushed Daniel's leg with every stride, following until hospital staff guided him aside. As Lily was wheeled into a treatment room, Daniel looked back to see Ranger sitting in the hallway, tail still, eyes locked on the door where they'd taken her. The war was behind them, but Daniel knew, looking at that dog, Ranger was still on duty. The corridors of Willow Creek Medical Center hummed with a low, constant rhythm ventilators, monitors, the faint squeak of rubber soles on waxed floors. Outside, snowflakes continued their slow descent, pressing against the tall, narrow windows like moths to a light they couldn't reach. The pediatric ward was tucked into the quieter west wing, its pastel walls painted with cartoon forests and smiling animals, a design choice that had faded under the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights. In room 214, Lily lay propped against crisp hospital pillows, her small frame dwarfed by the bed. Her face had regained a bit of color after the initial emergency, but her breathing was still shallow. Ranger sat beside the bed, front paws square on the floor, amber eyes fixed on her like a sentry who understood the weight of his post. Daniel sat in the chair near the window, shoulders hunched forward, the kind of posture a soldier takes when there's nothing to fight yet too much to lose. His jacket was draped over the back of the chair, and the bouquet he had brought earlier now sat in a plastic pitcher on the counter. The door opened with a soft click. Marissa stepped in, her boots tapping lightly on the linoleum. She was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with long chestnut hair pulled into a loose knot. She wore a tailored wool coat over a cream sweater dress, the kind of outfit that suggested she had been somewhere nicer than the hospital before coming here. Her makeup was impeccable, but her eyes darted briefly to Ranger before settling on Daniel. "I came as soon as I could," she said, her voice smooth but a fraction too quick, as if rehearsed. Daniel glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. "Traffic?" he asked, his tone even. She gave a small shrug, lips curving into a non-committal smile. "Something like that." She brushed a lock of hair behind her ear and walked to Lily's side, resting a hand on the blanket. "How's she doing?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Better now. We got here just in time." Ranger didn't move, but his gaze followed Marissa's every step, his body angled subtly between her and the bed. A nurse named Sharon Webb, in her late 40s, entered behind Marissa. Sharon had the brisk efficiency of someone who had worked long enough to recognize trouble without fanfare. Her short salt and pepper hair framed a face lined more from squinting and concentration than age. "Vitals are holding steady," she told Daniel, adjusting the IV line with a practiced hand. "She needs rest." Sharon's eyes flicked to Ranger. "And maybe some quiet," she added with a faint smile. Daniel gave a nod, and Sharon left as silently as she came. The hours stretched thin, the hum of the radiator, the beeping of the heart monitor, each sound became part of the night's uneasy rhythm. Daniel dozed lightly in the chair, waking at every small movement from Lily. Ranger remained at his post, his head occasionally lowering to rest gently on Lily's forearm. In the muted glow of the overhead light, his coat looked like a burnished suit of armor, each strand of fur catching the pale shimmer of the room. It was close to 2 a.m. when the hallway sounds shifted footsteps that didn't belong to the staff's usual patterns. They were slow, measured, and stopped just outside the door. Ranger's ears twitched. His body stiffened. A faint click of metal followed, the sound of a door handle tested quietly. Daniel stirred but didn't open his eyes fully, thinking it might be a nurse on rounds. Then, the door eased open a fraction, enough for a shadow to slip in. Victor Hale stepped inside, moving like a man used to avoiding notice. Mid-40s, medium build, with sandy blonde hair combed back and a tan that seemed out of place in a Montana winter. His face carried the kind of easy charm that could turn sharp without warning. He wore a black leather jacket and jeans, but his boots were too clean for the weather outside. His pale blue eyes swept the room, and when they landed on Lily, a flicker of something colder passed through them. Before he could take another step, Ranger was up, muscles coiled, a deep, rolling growl vibrating through the room. It was a sound Daniel had only heard in combat zones, the warning before impact. Victor froze, one foot still in mid-shift. The shepherd's amber eyes locked on him, the distance between them feeling suddenly small. Ranger took a deliberate step forward, his body low, ready to launch if needed. Victor's gaze darted to Daniel, now fully awake and standing, his hand resting on the chair back. "Wrong room," Victor said, his voice flat but carrying no apology. He eased back toward the door, Ranger followed apace, keeping himself between Victor and the bed. The movement drew Sharon back into the hall. She took one look at Victor retreating in Ranger's stance. "Sir, you need to leave this floor immediately," she said, her voice sharp. Victor didn't argue. He slipped out, the door swinging shut behind him. Sharon's eyes narrowed. "Security's been called," she told Daniel. "I'll have someone posted outside." Daniel sat back down, his heart still hammering. He glanced at Ranger, whose growl had faded but whose ears stayed forward, eyes on the door as if expecting it to open again. He reached down, his fingers brushing the dog's head. "Good boy," he murmured. Ranger blinked slowly, then moved back to Lily's side, laying his head on her arm once more. The rest of the night passed without another attempt. A uniformed security guard appeared within minutes, taking a seat in the hallway with a thermos of coffee and a paperback novel. Daniel stayed awake until dawn, watching the snow ease outside the window, every so often looking at Ranger and thinking about the words etched on that old tag "Protect First." 2 days after the long white night at Willow Creek Medical Center, Lily was stable enough to come home. The winter air bit harder now, the snow on the driveway compacted into icy ridges under the weight of passing boots and Ranger's steady patrols. Daniel carried Lily up the porch steps, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. She was light, too light, and the way her head rested against his shoulder without resistance made his jaw tighten. Ranger trotted ahead, his paws leaving precise tracks in the snow, checking the yard before stepping aside to let them through the front door. Inside, the living room still smelled faintly of old wood and dish soap. Daniel had spent the morning warming the place up, stoking the small wood-burning stove in the corner until it crackled cheerfully. Lily's favorite blanket, a faded quilt patched by Daniel's late mother, was already draped over the couch. Marissa stood in the kitchen doorway, arms folded. She was dressed in a fitted black turtleneck and slim gray slacks, her hair pulled back into a smooth twist. The smile she offered didn't quite reach her eyes. "Glad to see you both home," she said, glancing briefly at Lily before turning her gaze to Daniel. Daniel didn't answer right away. He guided Lily to the couch, tucking the quilt around her shoulders. "You need anything, Peanut?" he asked. Lily shook her head faintly, eyes half-lidded, still tired from her stay in the hospital. Ranger settled on the rug beside the couch, head high, ears swiveling as if he expected the walls themselves to move. The afternoon wore on in a slow rhythm. Snow began again outside, tapping softly at the windows. Daniel was in the kitchen making tea when a sudden scrape of claws on hardwood made him turn. Ranger was no longer by the couch. He was in the far corner of the living room, tail straight, head down. His nose was buried between the side of the sofa and the wall. A muffled grunt came from him. Then he backed out, jaws clamped around something. Daniel stepped closer, brow furrowed. It was a man's felt hat, dark gray, with a faint sheen from wear. The brim was slightly bent, as if it had been handled roughly. But what caught Daniel was the scent-sharp, chemical, the same antiseptic tang he remembered from the night at the hospital. Ranger dropped the hat at Daniel's feet and let out a bark, then another, sharper this time, tail stiff. His amber eyes were locked on Daniel's face, communicating something beyond the reach of words. This shouldn't be here. Marissa's heels clicked as she stepped in from the kitchen. "What's that?" she asked, her tone light but her fingers twitching at her side. Daniel didn't look at her. "Where did this come from?" he asked evenly. Marissa shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe it was left from the previous owner. You know this house still has junk from before we moved in." Her words were quick, a little too smooth. Ranger barked again, taking a step toward her, the fur along his spine lifting slightly. Before Daniel could press further, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Deputy Nora Collins, the county's deputy sheriff, standing in the swirling snow. Nora was in her mid-40s, her short auburn hair tucked under a brown felt hat, her cheeks red from the cold. She was tall, with a no-nonsense stance that suggested she'd been in law enforcement long enough to know when someone was lying. "Daniel," she greeted with a curt nod, stamping snow from her boots before stepping inside. She glanced at Lily on the couch and gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I heard about the hospital incident," Nora began, unbuttoning her coat to reveal her badge and a thick sweater. "Figured it'd be smart to do a quick welfare check. Also wanted to drop off a few things." From her coat pocket, she produced a small stack of pamphlets and cards. "That's the state's Child Protective Hotline. And here," she handed Daniel a flyer, "is a local security contractor. I'd recommend upgrading your cameras and locks as soon as possible. Daniel took the items, his gaze flicking toward the felt hat still lying on the floor. You know anyone around here wear something like that? He asked. Nora crouched, inspecting it without touching. Looks expensive, she said. Not exactly something a farmhand would have. Smell that? Daniel nodded grimly. Nora's expression hardened. Chemical disinfectant. Strong one. Same as they use in some hospital supply rooms. You should hang on to this. Marissa shifted in the doorway, her arms crossing tighter. You're making something out of nothing, she said, her voice sharp now. Nora straightened, her eyes cool. Sometimes nothing turns into something when you leave it alone long enough. She turned back to Daniel. I'll have a patrol car swing by here tonight, just in case. After Nora left, Daniel stood for a long moment, the sound of her boots crunching away fading into the snow-muffled evening. He reached down and picked up the hat, holding it by the brim. Ranger sat at his feet, gaze steady, as if waiting for Daniel to connect the dots he'd already scented. That night, after Lily had drifted to sleep and the wind pressed against the windows, Daniel placed the hat in a sealed bag and locked it in his desk drawer. Ranger settled beside the couch where Lily slept, head resting on his paws, but his eyes stayed open long into the night. The cold that evening had a metallic bite, the kind that made even the most familiar streets feel hostile. Willow Creek lay under a heavy quilt of snow, its houses glowing faintly behind frosted windows. Inside Daniel's home, the wood stove crackled, casting slow, dancing shadows across the living room. Lily sat on the couch wrapped in her quilt, Ranger lying at her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes always open. Daniel glanced at the clock, frowning. The small orange pill bottle on the counter was nearly empty. Lily's antibiotics prescribed after her hospital stay would run out by tomorrow. He pulled on his coat and scarf, bending to kiss the top of her head. I'll be back in 20 minutes, he said, his voice steady. Ranger's ears twitched at the change in routine. Daniel gave the dog's head a firm pat. Stay. Marissa emerged from the hallway, already dressed in a tailored gray coat, her hair sleek and pinned at the nape of her neck. She held a slim leather clutch and wore a perfume that smelled faintly of winter flowers. I've got to run out too, she said, not meeting Daniel's eyes. Errand in town. Daniel's gaze lingered on her, but he didn't press. Don't leave her alone, he said. Won't, Marissa replied lightly, already slipping on her gloves. Yet as soon as Daniel's truck headlights faded into the darkness, the sound of the back door's latch whispered through the quiet house. The kitchen camera's green light blinked steadily from its perch above the pantry. Ranger's head lifted, amber eyes narrowing toward the rear of the house. A shadow moved past the frosted glass panel of the back door. The handle turned, slow and deliberate, and Victor Hale stepped in. His leather jacket glistened faintly with melting snow, his blonde hair damp, his boots almost soundless on the tile. In his right hand, he held a syringe filled with a pale, opaque liquid. The needle caught the dim light, a thin glint of steel. His face was calm in a way that made it more menacing, lips pressed in a flat line, eyes scanning like he was walking into an empty warehouse, not a child's home. Lily froze on the couch, clutching the edge of her blanket. Where's your mom? Victor asked, his voice too smooth. She didn't answer. He took a step forward, the syringe angled toward her small arm. The air seemed to snap in that instant. Ranger exploded off the rug like a fired round, claws scraping hardwood. His body slammed into Victor's side with enough force to knock the man into the edge of the counter. The syringe clattered from his hand, skidding across the floor before shattering against a cabinet door. The sharp scent of chemicals burst into the air. Victor cursed, shoving at the dog, but Ranger's teeth were already clamped around his forearm, the same arm that had held the syringe. The shepherd's jaws locked, muscles taut, a deep growl vibrating from his chest. Victor tried to yank free, but Ranger shifted his weight, using every pound of his frame to force the man back. Go, Lily! Daniel's voice wasn't there, but Ranger's urgency was. The girl scrambled from the couch, bare feet slapping the wood floor, and ran to the front door. She flung it open and darted into the snowy night toward the nearest neighbor's porch, screaming for help. Back in the kitchen, Victor's attempts to shake Ranger off only made the grip tighten. The dog's eyes burned, his ears flat against his head. Then came the slam of a door from outside. Deputy Nora Collins, drawn by Lily's cries, burst in with her service weapon drawn. She had been on an evening patrol nearby, her heavy brown coat dusted with snow, a flashlight in one hand. Her eyes took in the scene in a heartbeat, the shattered syringe, the chemical smell, Ranger's locked grip. "Freeze!" Nora barked, her voice cutting the air. Victor went rigid, panting. "Call him off!" he hissed through clenched teeth. Nora's gaze didn't leave him. "Ranger, out!" The command was crisp, and the shepherd obeyed, releasing the arm and stepping back just enough to keep himself between Victor and the doorway. Within minutes, backup arrived, Deputy Mark Evans, a younger officer with a stocky build and close-cropped dark hair. He carried an evidence kit, his breath clouding in the cold as he stepped inside. "Get him cuffed," Nora instructed, moving to the kitchen. She slipped on gloves, crouched to collect the syringe's broken pieces, the sticky liquid still clinging to the shards. "We'll need this bagged and tagged." Mark secured Victor, reading him his rights as the man's face twisted between anger and something colder. Daniel's truck pulled into the drive just as Victor was being led out. He sprinted inside, his boots leaving wet prints. "Lily?" he called, voice taut. From the neighbor's doorway, Lily waved, her cheeks red from the cold, Ranger at her side. Daniel gathered her into his arms, holding her close, his eyes briefly closing in relief. Back in the kitchen, Nora laid out the items on the counter, the shattered syringe, a pair of black gloves found in Victor's coat pocket, and, from Daniel's earlier report, the gray felt hat its brim now sealed in an evidence bag. "These go straight to the lab," Nora said. "Chain of custody starts now." She glanced at Daniel. "Camera caught everything. This is airtight." Daniel knelt beside Ranger, his hand on the dog's neck. "Good boy," he said quietly. Ranger's breathing slowed, but his gaze stayed locked on the back door as though memorizing it for future patrols. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the eaves. Nora closed her notebook with a snap. "We'll talk more tomorrow. For tonight, lock every door and window, and keep him," she nodded toward Ranger, "right where he is." Morning broke pale and brittle over Willow Creek, the kind of winter light that made every surface seem sharper. The snow in the backyard was pocked with paw prints from Ranger's restless patrols during the night. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and the cedar from the wood stove. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, one hand wrapped around a mug, the other absently rubbing the old K9 tag on Ranger's collar. Across the room, Ranger paced slowly, nose lifted as if tasting the air for something unseen. Victor Hale was now sitting in the county jail, awaiting arraignment. Deputy Nora Collins had spent the better part of the previous evening filing reports and securing the evidence from the syringe incident. Now the focus had shifted. There was still the matter of Marissa, her absences, her evasions, her connection to Victor. She had been brought in for questioning that morning, wearing a pale blue sweater and tailored slacks, her hair pulled into a low chignon. The calmness she projected in public was there, but thinner, as though the edges of her composure had been frayed. In the interrogation room, she kept her answers clipped, denying knowledge of Victor's intentions, claiming she barely saw him in weeks. Nora wasn't convinced. Later that afternoon, Nora stopped by Daniel's property. She was bundled in her thick brown coat, her boots crunching on the icy path to the back porch. "We're still piecing things together," she told Daniel, "but I want to check the property again, especially out back." Ranger stood at her side as if he'd been waiting for that cue. Without hesitation, he trotted toward the far edge of the yard, his breath pluming in the cold. The storage shed, once a tool and gardening supply shelter, sat half-hidden under the drooping limbs of a spruce tree. Its padlock hung loosely, not latched. Ranger sniffed the base of the door, then began to circle the shed, pausing at one corner. With a quick look at Daniel, he started to dig, snow and frozen dirt spraying behind him. Within moments, his claws scraped against fabric. Daniel knelt, brushing away the snow to reveal a canvas duffel bag, damp but intact. Nora slipped on gloves before unzipping it. Inside was a small pile of items that made Daniel's chest tighten. Lily's missing stuffed rabbit, a faded sweatshirt that still smelled faintly of her shampoo, and a hand towel stiff with dried residue. Nora lifted the towel to her nose and immediately grimaced. "Chloroform," she said. "Strong." At the bottom of the bag was a folded sheet of paper-lined notebook paper covered in Victor's cramped handwriting. Daniel leaned in to read. The list was chilling in its simplicity. Dates and times, mostly evenings, each annotated with D out or alone. "We'll send all of this to the lab," Nora said, sealing the bag in an evidence sack. She gave Ranger an approving look. "He just saved us weeks of guesswork." Ranger stood with his tail still, watching as the evidence was taken away, his breath steady in the cold air. Back inside, the house felt quieter, heavier. Daniel sat Lily at the kitchen counter with a cup of cocoa, her legs swinging above the floor. She didn't say much, but her eyes followed Ranger as he padded back to his spot by the stove. The hospital had called earlier in the day. The bruising and swelling in Lily's abdomen had been confirmed as the result of blunt force trauma, not illness. The news sat in Daniel's gut like ice, each word a weight. That Sunday, Daniel found himself in the pews of Willow Creek's small white church for the first time in years. The sanctuary smelled faintly of pine from the garlands strung along the windows. Reverend Earl Whitaker, a man in his 60s with a kind, weathered face and silver hair combed neatly back, led the service with a warmth that felt less like performance and more like conversation. Earl had served in the Navy decades ago, and there was a calm steadiness in his voice that Daniel recognized. After the service, Earl approached, his blue eyes glancing from Daniel to Lily, then down to Ranger. "You've all been through something," he said gently. "I can see it in the way you stand." He told Daniel about the church's volunteer woodworking group, men and women who built furniture for families in need. "It's good work," Earl said. "Keeps the hands busy and the mind clear, and you can bring 'em," he added, nodding toward Ranger. The following Wednesday, Daniel and Lily joined the group in the church's workshop, a converted barn that smelled of sawdust and varnish. Ranger settled on an old blanket in the corner, his eyes tracking every movement. Lily sat at a bench beside Daniel, sanding the edge of a pine board. Occasionally, she glanced over at Ranger, who seemed to give a small, approving blink each time she looked his way. One of the older volunteers, a retired teacher named Mrs. Gail Thompson, brought over cookies and cocoa, her white hair tucked into a knitted cap. "That dog's got a way of making a place feel safe," she remarked. Daniel found the rhythm of the work soothing. The scrape of sandpaper, the measured tap of a mallet, it grounded him. His mind still flashed to the image of Lily in the hospital bed, but here, with her humming softly beside him and Ranger sprawled nearby, the image lost some of its sting. Earl stopped by their bench at the end of the evening, resting a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You're building more than wood here," he said. "You're building back trust." By the time they left, the night sky over Willow Creek was clear, the stars sharp against the black. Ranger walked slightly ahead, his breath visible in the cold, his pace measured as if still on patrol. The courthouse in Willow Creek was an old brick building, its stone steps worn smooth from decades of foot traffic. The winter air was sharp that morning, the breath of every passerby curling in pale clouds. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of polished wood and paper. Daniel sat at the defendant's table, his posture straight but his fingers laced together tightly, betraying the tension in his frame. Beside him, Ranger lay on a thick blanket the bailiff had placed earlier, his black and tan coat sleek under the courtroom lights, amber eyes scanning the room with quiet alertness. His presence had been approved by the judge after a child psychologist testified that Ranger was a living, calming agent for Lily, someone who could make a terrifying process feel less overwhelming. Thomas Garner, Daniel's attorney, was a man in his early 50s with silver hair neatly parted to the side. His suit was dark and pressed, but it was the sharp intelligence in his pale green eyes that made him stand out. He spoke in a low, even tone that could turn razor-sharp when needed. Across the aisle sat Marissa and her attorney, Colleen Price, a woman in her 40s with cropped blonde hair and a wardrobe that blended professionalism with calculated warmth. She wore a deep blue blazer, her smile polite but thin. The judge, Honorable Miriam Hale, presided with a calm but commanding presence. In her late 50s, she had a lined face and piercing brown eyes that missed little. She adjusted her reading glasses as Thomas rose to present evidence. "Your Honor," he began, "we submit into evidence the security camera footage from the defendant's home, the gray felt hat recovered from the living room, the forensic report on the syringe seized during the attempted assault, and the medical report from Willow Creek Medical Center confirming the source of Lily Reed's injuries." The clerk took each item, placing them on the evidence table. On the screen behind the witness stand, the video played, Victor entering through the back door, syringe in hand, Ranger's sudden attack, knocking him off balance, Lily fleeing the frame. There was no sound, but the imagery was enough to make a ripple pass through the spectators. Thomas continued, his tone measured. "We also have copies of text messages obtained from the phone records of Marissa Reed and Victor Hale." He handed a thick, stapled packet to the clerk. In these messages, the two discussed strategies to remove Mr. Reed from his parental rights, referencing his military deployments as abandonment, and, he flipped a page, planning for Mr. Hale to handle the child situation. Marissa shifted in her seat, crossing her legs tightly, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. Colleen leaned in to whisper something, but Marissa's jaw remained set. The judge nodded. "Let's proceed with the child witness," she said. The bailiff stepped out, returning moments later with Lily. She wore a simple cream sweater and navy leggings, her blonde hair pulled into a loose braid. In her arms, she clutched Ranger's thick neck, her small fingers disappearing into his fur. He walked beside her, matching her slow pace as she approached the witness stand. The clerk swore her in, and Lily nodded, her voice barely audible as she answered. Thomas approached slowly, crouching a little to meet her eye level. "Lily," he began gently, "can you tell the court what happened the night Ranger barked in the kitchen?" She hesitated, glancing at the judge, then down at Ranger, who looked up at her steadily. He barked and ran to me," she said in a small voice. "Victor was there with something in his hand." Ranger pushed him away. Thomas nodded. "And how did you feel when that happened?" Lily's arms tightened around Ranger's neck. "I wasn't scared when Ranger was there. He always stays." Her voice wavered, but she kept going. "At night, I can sleep 'cause he's right by me." There was a pause in the room, the kind that seemed to make even the air hold still. The judge's eyes softened just slightly. Thomas smiled faintly. "Thank you, Lily. That's all." Colleen approached for cross-examination, her voice pitched to be gentle. "Lily, you know your mom loves you, right?" Lily looked confused. She leaves a lot," she said simply. Colleen pressed. "When your dad was away, your mom took care of you?" Lily's fingers toyed with Ranger's collar. "Sometimes, but mostly I took care of me." Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor, the sound oddly loud in the quiet room. After Lily stepped down, Ranger guided her back to the bench, lying at her feet with his head resting against her shoes. The judge called for a brief recess. Daniel leaned down to murmur to Lily, brushing her braid back over her shoulder. "You did great, Peanut." Ranger's eyes never left Marissa's side of the courtroom. When court resumed, Thomas played the last piece of evidence, a series of screenshots of the text exchanges. The words on the projector screen were stark. "If he's gone too much, we can say it's abandonment. Handle it before the hearing. Make sure she's not a problem." The time-stamped messages spoke for themselves. By the time Thomas concluded, the mood in the room had shifted. What began as a contested custody hearing was taking on the shape of something far more serious. Judge Hale made a note on the file in front of her, her face impassive. "We will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments," she said. "Court is adjourned." As the gavel struck, Ranger rose smoothly, positioning himself between Lily and the aisle as people began to shuffle out. Outside the courthouse, snow had started falling again, tiny crystals catching in Ranger's fur. Daniel glanced down at him, his voice quiet but certain. "One more day, buddy, more day." The morning of the verdict broke clear and cold, with sunlight bouncing off the courthouse's frosted windows like shards of glass. Daniel arrived early, his boots crunching over the thin crust of snow. He wore his only tailored suit navy, the same one he'd worn at his Army retirement ceremony, and a tie Lily had chosen for him, a deep forest green. Ranger padded beside him, his breath steaming in the frigid air, the scar along his rib catching a glint of light when they passed under a street lamp. Inside, the courtroom felt heavier than before. The previous day's testimony and evidence had left a weight in the air, the kind that made people speak in hushed tones without quite knowing why. Lily sat on the bench between Daniel and Deputy Nora Collins, her small hands buried in Ranger's ruff. Nora, in her tan sheriff's department uniform, looked her usual steady self tall, with a lean, athletic build, dark auburn hair pulled into a no-nonsense braid. She had a way of radiating calm in tense rooms, a skill sharpened by years in law enforcement, and a childhood spent in a turbulent household where keeping her voice steady meant keeping the peace. The opposing table was noticeably thinner in attendance. Marissa sat rigid, her expression a mask, but her eyes darted every so often toward the gallery, scanning for a friendly face and finding none. Victor was absent remanded to county jail the night before on charges of trespassing, possession of a controlled substance, and conspiracy to harm a child. His attorney's seat remained empty except for a neat stack of legal files, a silent admission that the case had slipped beyond control. Judge Miriam Hale entered, robes flowing, her voice even as she began reading her decision. In the matter of custody of minor child Lily Reed, after review of all submitted evidence, testimony, and cross-examination, the court finds that it is in the best interest of the child for full custody to be awarded to Daniel Reed. Marissa Reed is to have no contact with the child except under supervised visitation, to be arranged and approved by the court. Violations will result in immediate legal consequences. A soft gasp rippled through the spectators. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his shoulders eased fractionally. Lily glanced up at him, searching his face, and when she saw his faint smile, she leaned against him with a visible sigh of relief. Judge Hale continued, her gaze shifting toward the clerk. Furthermore, the court acknowledges the critical role played by a retired K-9 named Ranger, whose actions directly prevented harm to the minor on 2 separate occasions and provided crucial evidence in the investigation. It is recommended that the Willow Creek Town Council consider formal recognition of this animal's service. When court adjourned, the hallway filled with the mingled sounds of boots on tile, paper shuffling, and low murmurs. Nora caught Daniel's arm as they stepped outside. "Daniel," she said with the faintest hint of a grin, "I just spoke with Mayor Jenkins. They're going to present Ranger with the Community Honor Badge at next month's ceremony. First time they've ever given it to a dog." She glanced down at Ranger, who tilted his head as though listening. "You've got yourself a local hero." Daniel chuckled, rubbing Ranger's ear. "He's been that all along." That afternoon, life's other threads wove themselves back in. At the churchyard workshop, the volunteer woodworking group led by Pastor Earl Whitaker, a tall man with kind eyes and hands permanently dusted with sawdust, was putting the finishing touches on a small bed frame they'd been crafting for Lily. Earl's deep voice carried over the scent of cedar and varnish. "We don't just build furniture here, son," he said to Daniel. "We build reminders. Things kids can sleep in without fear." Lily stood nearby, wearing a thick red sweater and watching intently as Earl sanded the final corner. When he handed her a small carving tool, she knelt under the frame, her tongue peeking out in concentration as she etched a few careful letters into the wood. "Ranger's Watch." She ran her hand over the words, smiling to herself. Ranger, sprawled on the rug near the wood stove, lifted his head when she crawled out, as though approving the work. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, leaving patches of dark earth showing through. Winter wasn't over, but something in the air felt different, less like survival, more like the start of something that could grow. That evening, as the sun set in streaks of rose and gold, Daniel and Lily sat together on their porch, Ranger stretched at their feet. "You know," Daniel said softly, "spring's coming." Lily nodded, her gaze on the horizon. "I think it's already here," she murmured, slipping her hand into his. Ranger's tail thumped once, a quiet punctuation to the day's hard-won peace. By late March, the snow around the Reed house had receded into small, stubborn patches, clinging to the shadowed sides of the yard like old memories that refused to melt. The porch, once buried, now welcomed the faint smell of pine carried by the warming wind. Daniel stood at the kitchen counter in a faded gray t-shirt and jeans, sleeves rolled to his elbows, cracking eggs into a chipped ceramic bowl. His hair was slightly longer now, the sharp military cut softening at the edges. Beside him, perched on a step stool so she could see into the pan, Lily concentrated fiercely on whisking, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth. The salt shaker in her hand tipped a little too long over the bowl. "That's generous seasoning," Daniel said, the corner of his mouth quirking upward. Lily giggled, her cheeks still rounded with baby softness, but her eyes already holding a maturity that months ago had been born from fear. They stirred, poured, and waited, the sizzle of eggs filling the space. Ranger lay at the open back door, his massive frame blocking most of the threshold. At 10 years old, the German Shepherd's black and tan coat had begun to frost at the muzzle, but his amber eyes still tracked every movement with the alertness of a soldier. His tail tapped once when Daniel scraped the eggs onto 2 plates. Lily set one down for him, a smaller portion without salt, and he accepted it with a low, appreciative rumble. The day passed in easy chores. Daniel fixed the squeaky hinge on the bathroom cabinet. Lily planted 3 stubborn marigold seeds in a pot by the kitchen window, and Ranger alternated between dozing in sun patches and following them room to room. Outside, the pine trees swayed against a sky that was finally more blue than gray. By evening, the small living room was warm from the fire. A cake slightly lopsided, with uneven chocolate frosting, sat in the center of the coffee table, 9 candles waiting. Deputy Nora Collins arrived carrying a box wrapped in plain brown paper, her auburn braids swaying over one shoulder. She knelt to scratch behind Ranger's ear before handing Lily the package. Inside was a soft flannel blanket printed with tiny paw prints, stitched along the edges with Lily's name in neat navy thread. From the doorway, Pastor Earl Whitaker stepped in, smelling faintly of sawdust and cedar oil. He carried a small, square box and a smile that deepened the lines at the corners of his eyes. "Couldn't let this day pass without adding something to the story," he said. After the candles were blown out, Lily's wish kept secret, but her glance toward Ranger making it easy to guess, Daniel reached into his pocket. He drew out a narrow leather collar, new but softened by his hands, and fastened it gently around Ranger's neck. The metal tag swung forward, catching the firelight. $1 to save a life. Lily slid down from the couch to wrap both arms around Ranger's neck, pressing her cheek into the fur at his chest. "Home," she whispered, "is where I don't have to be afraid." Pastor Earl, standing near the fire, spoke in his low, steady voice. "True love," he said, "is choosing to stay." The words settled into the quiet like another log on the fire, deepening the warmth in the room. Nora placed a small, polished badge on the mantel, Willow Creek's Community Honor Badge engraved with Ranger's name. She stepped back, her usual reserve softening into something that looked almost like pride. The night wound down with laughter, messy slices of cake, and the comfortable shuffle of plates into the sink. The last frame of the day found Ranger in his spot at the back door, head lifted, ears pricked. His gaze moved between Daniel and Lily as if to say he understood this was no longer just a stop along the road, it was home, and he was on watch. Sometimes God's greatest miracles come wrapped in fur and loyalty. Ranger was not just a dog, he was a guardian sent at the right time. Proof that heaven often works through the most unexpected messengers. In our own lives, we may not face the exact dangers Daniel and Lily did, but we all walk through storms, and God places people, or even animals, in our path to guide and protect us. Cherish them. Trust that no matter how dark the night feels, His light will find a way in. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with Amen to stand with every child who deserves safety, and subscribe so we can keep telling stories that remind the world of God's love. May the Lord bless and protect you and your family always.